Alpha Queen brought her deaf daughter to the winter feast. A warrior's silent signs made her smile. The stone halls of Wintercrest Manor echoed with preparation as servants rushed through corridors carrying bundles of evergreen boughs and crimson ribbons. Queen Eleanor stood at the tall window of her private chambers, watching snow fall in thick curtains across the courtyard below. Her reflection in the frosted glass showed a woman of 35 winters, her auburn hair twisted into an elaborate braid that fell across one shoulder, her green eyes carrying the weight of a kingdom's expectations. Behind her, sitting cross-legged on the fur rug before the fireplace, was her daughter Rosalind. The girl was 9 years old, small for her age, with her mother's copper hair and her late father's gentle brown eyes. She traced patterns in the air with her fingers, lost in a world of movement and light that only she could fully comprehend. Eleanor had learned early that Rosalind experienced the world differently, through vibrations in the floorboards, through the flutter of candlelight, through the expressions on people's faces when they spoke. The child had been born unable to hear, and while Eleanor had consulted every physician and scholar in 3 counties, none could restore what had never been there. The winter feast would begin in 3 hours, and Eleanor felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. This was Rosalind's first time attending the grand celebration, and Eleanor knew the court would be watching, judging, whispering behind jeweled fans about the Queen's afflicted daughter. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world, leave a comment and tell me where you're from. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Eleanor turned from the window and knelt beside her daughter. She gently touched Rosalind's shoulder to get her attention, then began the series of hand movements they had developed together over the years, their own private language. "Are you ready for tonight?" her hands asked. Rosalind's face brightened, and she nodded enthusiastically. Her small hands moved rapidly in response. "Will there be music? Can I feel the drums?" Eleanor smiled, her heart aching with love and worry in equal measure. "Yes, my darling. The drummers will play, and you can stand close to feel the vibrations. But remember, there will be many people. Stay near me." The girl's expression shifted to something more serious, more vulnerable. "Will they stare at me?" her hands asked. Before Eleanor could respond, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Margaret, Eleanor's lady-in-waiting and closest friend since childhood, entered without waiting for permission. Her round face was flushed from climbing the tower stairs. "Your Majesty, the first guests have arrived. Lord Pemberton and his entourage are in the Great Hall, and more carriages are coming up the road." Eleanor stood, smoothing the front of her burgundy velvet gown. "Tell them I'll receive them shortly. And Margaret, where is Captain Thorne? I requested his presence an hour ago." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "The captain returned from the Northern Patrol just this morning, my lady. He's been with the armory master checking the weapons stores. Shall I send for him?" "Please do. I need to discuss the security arrangements for the feast." Eleanor glanced back at Rosalind, who was now standing and examining her own dress, a creation of winter white silk embroidered with silver snowflakes. The child ran her hands over the fabric, feeling its texture, oblivious to the conversation happening above her head. As Margaret departed, Eleanor knelt again and caught Rosalind's attention. "Come, little one, it's time to show the kingdom who you truly are." The great hall of Wintercrest had been transformed into a winter wonderland. Garlands of pine and holly draped from the high ceiling beams, and hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows across the stone walls. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, honeyed pastries, and spiced wines. Musicians occupied a raised platform near the back of the hall, and the air already hummed with conversation and laughter. Eleanor entered with Rosalind's small hand clasped firmly in her own. The crowd parted as they moved through it, and Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon them. She held her head high, her crown of twisted silver and garnets catching the candlelight. Rosalind walked beside her, chin lifted in an unconscious imitation of her mother's regal bearing, though her free hand clutched at Eleanor's sleeve. Lord Pemberton, a corpulent man with a silver beard and calculating eyes, approached immediately. "Your Majesty, a splendid gathering, and this must be the young princess. What a charming child." Eleanor recognized the false warmth in his voice, the way his gaze flickered dismissively over Rosalind before returning to her. "My daughter Rosalind. She is pleased to attend her first winter feast." "Can she understand me?" Pemberton asked, speaking slowly and loudly as if volume might somehow bridge the gap. "She can read lips to some extent, Lord Pemberton, though she cannot hear your tone. I assure you her comprehension is excellent." Eleanor's voice carried an edge that made the Lord step back slightly. Before the conversation could become more uncomfortable, a commotion at the hall's entrance drew everyone's attention. Captain Marcus Thorne had arrived, still wearing his traveling cloak dusted with snow. He was a tall man of perhaps 30 years, with dark hair cropped short in the military fashion, and a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, a souvenir from a border skirmish 2 years prior. His presence commanded immediate respect, and several nobles moved aside as he strode toward the Queen. He stopped at a respectful distance and bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, I apologize for my tardiness. The northern roads were worse than expected." Eleanor gestured for him to rise. "Captain Thorne, welcome back. I trust the patrol found no trouble." "Nothing beyond the usual winter hardships, my lady. The northern villages are secure." As he spoke, his eyes drifted down to Rosalind, who was staring at him with undisguised curiosity. The child had never seen a warrior fresh from patrol, and his weather-worn appearance seemed to fascinate her. Thorne's expression softened immediately. He knelt, bringing himself to the girl's eye level, and offered a gentle smile. Then, to Eleanor's complete surprise, his hands began to move in deliberate, careful gestures. They were simple signs, but unmistakable in their intent. "Hello, Princess. I am Marcus." Rosalind's eyes widened in shock and delight. Her hands flew up in response. "You know the hand language?" Thorne's smile broadened. "A little. I learned from my sister. She is like you. She hears with her eyes and her heart instead of her ears." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the crowded hall or the blazing fireplaces. She watched as her daughter's face transformed with pure joy, watched as the child engaged in animated conversation with this scarred warrior who had somehow bridged a gap that separated her from nearly everyone else in the kingdom. "Where is your sister now?" Rosalind asked, her movements quick and eager. "She lives in the east, with her husband and 3 children. She teaches other children who cannot hear, helps them learn to communicate with their families." Thorne's hands moved with increasing confidence, though Eleanor could see he was searching for some of the signs, adapting as he went. "Will you teach me more signs?" Rosalind asked. "Mother and I have our own way of talking, but it's not a real language. It's just ours." Before Thorne could respond, Eleanor cleared her throat gently. "Captain, I wasn't aware you possessed this skill. Why did you never mention it?" Thorne rose, a faint color touching his weathered cheeks. "It never seemed relevant to my duties, Your Majesty. But I spent years learning from my sister, learning to see the world as she does. When I saw the princess, I thought..." He trailed off, uncertain. "You thought correctly." Eleanor's voice was softer than she intended. "Rosalind has very few people who can communicate with her in any meaningful way. This gift of yours is more valuable than any sword skill, at least to me." The feast progressed with the usual pageantry. Nobles presented their offerings to the Queen, bolts of fine cloth, carved wooden boxes, promises of loyalty, and Eleanor accepted each with practiced grace. But her attention kept drifting to Rosalind, who had not left Marcus Thorne's side. The captain had appointed himself the child's guide and translator, helping her navigate the overwhelming social landscape of the feast. When the musicians began to play, Rosalind tugged on Thorne's sleeve and pointed toward the drummers. He understood immediately and led her closer to the platform, positioning her where she could feel the vibrations through the floor. Eleanor watched as her daughter closed her eyes, swaying slightly to rhythms only she could sense through the trembling of the wooden boards beneath her feet. Margaret appeared at Eleanor's elbow, carrying a cup of spiced wine. "The captain is quite taken with the princess. I've never seen him so gentle. Usually he's all business and barked orders." "He has a sister who is deaf," Eleanor murmured, accepting the cup but not drinking from it. "He understands Rosalind in a way few others can." "And you, Your Majesty? How do you find the captain's unexpected talents?" Margaret's tone was carefully neutral, but Eleanor could hear the unspoken question beneath it. "I find them remarkable. Nothing more." But even as she spoke, Eleanor knew it was a lie. There was something stirring in her, something she had not felt since her husband's death 3 years ago. King Richard had been a good man, a kind father, but their marriage had been one of duty and companionship rather than passion. Eleanor had accepted that such was the way of royal unions, that love was a luxury queens could not afford. Now, watching Marcus Thorne kneel beside her daughter, watching him patiently explain through hand signs what each instrument was and how it produced sound through vibration and air, Eleanor felt something dangerous awakening in her heart. The evening wore on, and eventually, Rosalind's energy began to flag. Eleanor could see the exhaustion in her daughter's eyes, the way she leaned more heavily against Thorne's shoulder. She made her way through the crowd toward them, and Thorne noticed her approach immediately. He stood, helping Rosalind to her feet. "I think the princess is ready to retire," he said quietly. "It's been a long evening for her." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you, Captain Thorne. Your kindness tonight has meant more than you know. Rosalind, say goodnight to the captain." The child's hands moved slowly, fatigue making her gestures clumsy. "Thank you for being my friend. Will you visit again?" Thorne's response was immediate and sincere. "I promise. I will teach you more signs, and you can teach me about being brave like your mother." Rosalind smiled, then threw her arms around Thorne's waist in an impulsive hug. The warrior looked startled for a moment, then gently patted the child's back, his scarred face softening with an expression Eleanor had never seen on any of her soldiers. As Margaret led Rosalind away toward the family quarters, Eleanor found herself alone with the captain in a small alcove near the musicians' platform. The noise of the feast faded to a dull roar around them, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. "Your daughter is extraordinary," Thorne said finally. "She sees the world differently than we do, but not less clearly. Perhaps more clearly in some ways." "She is strong," Eleanor agreed. "Stronger than I was at her age. But it's difficult, watching her struggle to connect with people who don't understand her. Tonight was the first time I've seen her truly at ease with someone outside our small circle. My sister taught me that being different isn't the same as being less. She built a full life for herself, found love, raised children. She never let silence define her limits." Thorne paused, then added quietly, "I think Princess Rosalind will do the same. She has her mother's determination." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "You're very kind, Captain. But determination only takes one so far. The court can be cruel, and there are already whispers about Rosalind's suitability as heir. Then the court is full of fools." The bluntness of his statement surprised her. "I've served in battles, Your Majesty. I've seen men freeze in fear and others charge ahead despite their terror. Courage has nothing to do with hearing or speaking. It has to do with heart, and the princess has more heart than half the nobles in this hall." Eleanor smiled despite herself. "You're not known for your diplomatic skills." "Captain Thorne." "No, Your Majesty. I'm known for speaking truth, even when it's uncomfortable." He hesitated, then added, "If I may be so bold, you carry a heavy burden alone." Perhaps you don't need to bear it entirely by yourself." Before Eleanor could respond, Lord Pemberton appeared again, his face flushed with wine and his voice booming. "Your Majesty, we're preparing the gift presentations. Your presence is required at the high table." The moment broke. Eleanor straightened, her royal mask sliding back into place. "Of course, Lord Pemberton. Captain Thorne, you're dismissed for the evening. Get some rest after your long patrol." Thorne bowed formally, but as he turned to leave, Eleanor caught his arm briefly. "Captain, I would like you to continue spending time with Rosalind. If you're willing, of course. I think your presence would be beneficial to her education and her happiness." His eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between them. "It would be my honor, Your Majesty." The following morning dawned gray and cold, with fresh snow falling heavily over Wintercrest. Eleanor woke early, as was her habit, and made her way to Rosalind's chambers to check on the child. She found her daughter already awake, sitting at the window and watching the snow accumulate on the courtyard stones. Eleanor touched Rosalind's shoulder gently, and the girl turned with a bright smile. Her hands moved quickly. "Is Captain Thorne coming today? He promised to teach me more signs. He said he would visit, but the snow is very heavy. It may be difficult for him to reach the manor." Even as she spoke, Eleanor felt a strange disappointment. She had lain awake much of the night thinking about the captain, about the way he had looked at Rosalind with such genuine affection and respect. But Rosalind was already shaking her head, pointing excitedly toward the courtyard. Eleanor followed her gesture and saw a figure moving through the snow. Marcus Thorne, bundled in a heavy cloak, trudging through drifts that reached his knees. Eleanor's heart gave an unexpected lurch. She hurried Rosalind through her morning routine, helping the child dress in a warm wool gown and thick stockings. By the time they reached the small study Eleanor had designated for the lesson, Thorne was already there, stomping snow from his boots and warming his hands by the fire. "Captain, you didn't need to come in such weather," Eleanor said, though her tone belied the words. "I gave my word, Your Majesty. And besides, I brought something." He reached into his pack and withdrew a leather-bound book, its pages worn soft with use. "This belonged to my sister. It's a collection of hand signs she compiled over the years, from different regions and different teachers. I thought the princess might find it useful." Rosalind practically vibrated with excitement as Thorne opened the book and began to show her the illustrations within. Detailed drawings of hand positions, each labeled with its meaning. Eleanor watched as teacher and student bent over the pages together, Thorne demonstrating each sign slowly, while Rosalind mimicked his movements with intense concentration. What struck Eleanor most was the patience in Thorne's manner. He never showed frustration when Rosalind struggled with a particular gesture, never made her feel inadequate or slow. Instead, he found creative ways to help her remember, associating signs with physical objects in the room, creating small stories that linked multiple signs together, celebrating each small victory with genuine enthusiasm. Hours passed without Eleanor realizing it. She sat in a chair by the window, ostensibly reviewing correspondence from her various holdings, but in truth, simply observing the bond forming between her daughter and this unexpected teacher. Margaret brought lunch at midday: bread, cheese, cold meat, and hot cider. And the three of them ate together, while Rosalind excitedly demonstrated everything she had learned. "She's a natural student," Thorne said quietly to Eleanor while Rosalind was distracted with practicing a complex series of signs. "She has an excellent memory and real dedication. With time and proper instruction, she could become fluent in formal sign language. It would open entire communities to her. There are schools, gatherings, groups of people who communicate this way. She wouldn't be alone." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. "I didn't know such communities existed. I thought she would always be isolated, always struggling to be understood." "No, Your Majesty. There's a whole world out there for people like Rosalind. My sister is part of it. She writes to me about the schools that are being established. The teacher's being trained. It's still new, still developing, but it's real. He paused, then added softly, Princess Rosalind doesn't need to be fixed. She just needs to be understood and given the right tools. Those words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. For years she had been consumed with the idea that Rosalind needed to be cured, needed to be made more like everyone else. She had never considered that perhaps the problem wasn't with Rosalind at all, but with a world that refused to adapt to different ways of being. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for showing me that." The days that followed established a new pattern at Wintercrest. Every morning, weather permitting, Marcus Thorne would arrive for Rosalind's lessons. He brought books and stories, taught her not just signs, but also about the larger deaf community, about famous scholars and artists who had been unable to hear, but had contributed greatly to the world's knowledge and beauty. Eleanor found herself making excuses to be present during these lessons. She told herself it was to ensure Rosalind's education was progressing properly. But she knew the truth. She was drawn to Thorne himself. She loved watching him interact with her daughter, loved the rare smile that crossed his scarred face when Rosalind mastered a difficult concept. But more than that, she found herself enjoying their own conversations when Rosalind was distracted or resting. Thorne spoke of his years in service, of battles fought and lost, of the men under his command, and the heavy responsibility of leadership. Eleanor found in him a kindred spirit, someone who understood the weight of duty and the loneliness that came with power. He asked her about ruling, about the challenges of being a queen in a kingdom that still viewed women with suspicion, about balancing the needs of her people with the needs of her daughter. These conversations were dangerous, Eleanor knew. She could feel herself becoming attached, could feel her carefully maintained emotional distance crumbling. Marcus Thorne was her subject, her soldier, and any relationship beyond that would be complicated at best, scandalous at worst. But Rosalind was blooming under his attention. The shy, withdrawn child who had hidden behind Eleanor's skirts at the winter feast was transforming into someone more confident, more engaged with the world around her. She practiced her signs constantly, even teaching some of them to Margaret and the household servants. The manor was slowly adapting to accommodate her, and it was all because one warrior had taken the time to see her as she truly was. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the feast, Eleanor and Thorne were alone in the study while Rosalind napped. The child had exhausted herself with morning lessons and had finally consented to rest. Eleanor stood at the window, watching snow fall gently over the winter landscape, acutely aware of Thorne's presence behind her. "Your Majesty," he said quietly. "May I speak plainly?" "You always do, Captain," Eleanor replied, not turning around. Her heart was beating too quickly, and she didn't trust herself to maintain composure if she looked at him. "I've been thinking about Princess Rosalind's future. With your permission, I'd like to write to my sister. She knows educators, people who specialize in teaching deaf children. Perhaps we could arrange for one of them to come to Wintercrest, to continue Rosalind's education in a more formal capacity." Eleanor turned then, surprised and touched. "You would do that? Arrange for a teacher to travel all this way?" "Of course. The princess deserves every opportunity to reach her full potential. And..." He hesitated, his usual confidence faltering. "And I believe she has the right to know others like her, to understand that she's part of a larger community. This means a great deal to you." It wasn't a question. "My sister means a great deal to me. Watching her struggle, watching her triumph, it shaped who I am. When I see Princess Rosalind, I see the same strength, the same determination. I want her to have every advantage my sister fought so hard to gain." Eleanor moved closer to him, close enough that she could see the variations of brown in his eyes, the fine lines at their corners from years of squinting into sun and wind. "You're a remarkable man, Marcus Thorne. You've given my daughter something precious, the gift of being seen and understood. I don't know how to repay that." "I require no payment, Your Majesty." Seeing her happy is reward enough. They stood in silence for a long moment, the air between them charged with unspoken words. Eleanor knew she should step back, should maintain the proper distance between queen and subject. Instead, she found herself reaching out, touching the scar on his face with gentle fingers. "How did you get this?" she asked softly. "A border raid 2 years ago. A bandit's blade came closer than I'd have liked." His voice had dropped to match hers, intimate and low. "Does it pain you?" "Not anymore. Now it's just a reminder that I survived." Eleanor let her hand drop, suddenly aware of the impropriety of her gesture. But Thorn caught her wrist gently, holding her in place. "Your Majesty." "Eleanor, I should not speak what's in my heart, but I find I cannot stay silent. These weeks with you and Rosalind, they've been the happiest of my life, not because of duty or honor, but because of you." Eleanor's breath caught. "Marcus, we can't. I'm the queen, and you're your subject, yes, your soldier. I know the impossibility of it, but that doesn't change the truth." His thumb traced small circles on her wrist, sending shivers through her entire body. "I think about you constantly. Your strength, your devotion to Rosalind, the way you carry the weight of this kingdom on your shoulders without complaint. You're extraordinary. I'm also a widow with a young daughter and a kingdom that watches my every move," Eleanor said, but she didn't pull away. "Any relationship between us would be scrutinized, criticized. It could damage Rosalind, could undermine my authority." "I know," Thorn said quietly. "I know all of that. But I had to tell you the truth, even if nothing can come of it. You deserve to know that you're seen, that you're valued not just as a queen, but as a woman." Eleanor felt tears burning her eyes. "Marcus." Before she could finish, Rosalind burst into the room, sleep-tousled and excited. Her hands moved rapidly. "I had a dream. I was speaking with my hands to hundreds of people, and they all understood me." Eleanor and Thorn stepped apart quickly, but Rosalind seemed oblivious to the charged atmosphere. Thorn knelt and engaged her in conversation about her dream, and Eleanor used the moment to compose herself, to rebuild the walls that had been in danger of complete collapse. That evening, after Thorn had left and Rosalind was settled in bed, Eleanor sat alone in her chambers and allowed herself to cry. She cried for the impossibility of her situation, for the feelings she couldn't act upon, for the loneliness that had been her constant companion since Richard's death. But she also cried from gratitude, that Marcus Thorn existed, that he saw her, that for a brief moment she had felt truly alive again. The next morning brought news that would change everything. A messenger arrived from the eastern provinces with reports of unrest. Several noble families were quietly building alliances, spreading rumors about Eleanor's fitness to rule. The whispers focused primarily on Rosalind, her disability, her unsuitability as heir, the need for Eleanor to remarry and produce a proper successor. Eleanor called an emergency council meeting. Her advisors gathered in the war room, and Marcus Thorn was among them as captain of the guard. As the reports were read aloud, Eleanor watched the faces around the table. Some showed genuine concern, others barely concealed satisfaction at the mounting challenges to her rule. Lord Pemberton was particularly vocal. "Your Majesty, perhaps it's time to consider arrangements. The princess is a dear child, of course, but the kingdom needs stability. A marriage alliance with one of the great houses could silence these troublesome rumors." "You mean I should set Rosalind aside?" Eleanor said coldly. "Declare her unfit and remarry to produce a different heir. I would never use such harsh language, Your Majesty, but yes, for the good of the kingdom." Marcus Thorn's voice cut through the murmurs of agreement. "With respect, Lord Pemberton, the kingdom's good is not served by abandoning its legitimate heir simply because she communicates differently than we do. Princess Rosalind is intelligent, capable, and devoted to learning. These qualities matter far more than her ability to hear. "Easy for you to say, Captain," another lord sneered. "You're not responsible for the kingdom's future." "No, but I'm responsible for protecting it. And I can tell you that showing weakness by capitulating to bullies and gossips is far more dangerous than standing firm behind our rightful heir." Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude toward Marcus, but she knew this battle couldn't be won by sentiment alone. "Gentlemen, I hear your concerns. But let me be clear. Rosalind is my daughter and this kingdom's heir. I will not set her aside, and I will not remarry simply to satisfy political convenience. Instead, we will address these concerns directly. I'm calling a grand assembly in 6 weeks. Every noble house will send representatives, and we will demonstrate once and for all that Rosalind is capable of leadership." The council erupted in argument, but Eleanor remained firm. After the meeting disbanded, she found Marcus waiting in the corridor outside. "Thank you for your support," she said quietly. "I spoke the truth, nothing more." He glanced around to ensure they were alone, then added, "What you're planning is risky. If the assembly goes poorly, I know, but I won't hide Rosalind away or apologize for who she is. If this kingdom cannot accept her, then perhaps it doesn't deserve either of us." Eleanor's voice was fierce, almost defiant. Marcus smiled. "There's the warrior queen I know. What do you need from me?" "Help me prepare Rosalind. She needs to be able to communicate with the assembly, to show them her intelligence and her capability. We have 6 weeks to get her ready. Then we'll make every day count." The following weeks were intense. Marcus increased Rosalind's lessons, not just in sign language but in history, diplomacy, and statecraft. Eleanor participated fully, learning alongside her daughter. They practiced scenarios. Rosalind would be asked questions about governance, about trade policy, about military strategy, and she would respond through signs while Marcus translated aloud. But they needed more. Eleanor sent messengers to the east, to Marcus's sister, requesting her presence. And she commissioned a special project, a large illustrated book showing all the signs Rosalind used most frequently, so that nobles at the assembly could learn basic communication. It was an ambitious plan, perhaps foolhardy, but Eleanor was determined. As the weeks passed, Eleanor found herself falling deeper for Marcus Thorne. She tried to maintain distance, tried to remember all the reasons why such feelings were impossible. But watching him with Rosalind, seeing his dedication and his gentleness, made resistance increasingly difficult. One evening, 3 weeks before the assembly, they were reviewing Rosalind's progress after the child had gone to bed. They sat in Eleanor's private study, the fire burning low, speaking in hushed tones about strategy and preparation. "She's ready," Marcus said finally. "Better than ready. She's going to surprise everyone." "I hope you're right." Eleanor rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of exhaustion. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm being selfish, putting her through this. If I remarried as they suggest, Rosalind could live quietly, without the burden of queenship. Is that what you want? To teach her that being different means accepting less, hiding away? Of course not. But I want her to be happy, Marcus. I want her to have a life free from constant judgment and struggle." Marcus set down the papers he'd been reviewing and moved to kneel beside Eleanor's chair. "Look at me," he said gently. When she met his eyes, he continued, "Rosalind is happy. She's thriving. Yes, there are challenges, but she's meeting them with courage because you've taught her that she's worthy of respect exactly as she is. Don't doubt that now." Eleanor reached out, cupping his scarred face in both hands. "When did you become so wise?" "I learned from you," he said simply. Then, before either of them could think better of it, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was soft, tentative, full of all the longing they had both been suppressing for weeks. Eleanor's fingers threaded into his hair, pulling him closer. And for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. No kingdom, no duty, no impossible circumstances. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. "We can't," Eleanor whispered, but she didn't let go of him. "I know," Marcus replied. "But Eleanor, after the assembly, after Rosalind's position is secure, perhaps we could find a way. Not immediately, not in a way that would compromise you, but eventually." "You would wait? With no promises, no certainty?" "I would wait forever if necessary. You're worth it. You and Rosalind both." Eleanor pulled him close again, resting her forehead against his. "I don't deserve you." "You deserve everything, Eleanor. Everything good this world has to offer. And someday, I hope I can give you at least some of it." They sat like that for a long time, holding each other in the firelight, both knowing that the coming weeks would be crucial not just for Rosalind's future, but for their own as well. The day of the Grand Assembly arrived with crystalline winter sunshine that made the snow sparkle like diamonds. Nobles from across the kingdom had gathered at Wintercrest, filling the great hall to capacity. Eleanor stood in her chambers, adjusting her crown one final time, while Margaret fussed with the folds of her formal gown. "You're going to be magnificent," Margaret said. "Both of you." In the adjoining room, Rosalind was being helped into her own formal attire by Marcus's sister, Helena, who had arrived 2 weeks earlier. The woman was remarkable, quick-witted, sharp-eyed, and completely fluent in sign language. She had been working intensively with Rosalind, refining her communication skills and building her confidence. Helena entered Eleanor's chamber with Rosalind, and Eleanor's breath caught at the sight of her daughter. The girl wore a gown of royal blue velvet, her copper hair dressed with pearls, her young face set with determination. But it was her eyes that struck Eleanor most. They blazed with confidence and courage. "Are you ready?" Eleanor signed to her. Rosalind's response was firm. "I'm ready to show them who I am." They processed into the great hall together, Eleanor with her hand on Rosalind's shoulder. Marcus Thorne, in full ceremonial armor, walked beside them as captain of the guard. The assembled nobles rose as they entered, and Eleanor could feel the weight of their scrutiny. She took her place on the throne, with Rosalind standing at her right hand and Marcus at her left. Helena positioned herself near Rosalind, ready to translate if needed. Eleanor had prepared a speech, but looking out at the sea of faces, some curious, some skeptical, some openly hostile, she decided to abandon her prepared remarks. "Lords and ladies of the realm," she began, her voice carrying across the silent hall. "You've been summoned here to address concerns about the succession, about my daughter's fitness to someday rule this kingdom. Many of you have expressed doubts because Princess Rosalind cannot hear. Some have suggested she should be set aside in favor of a different heir. Before we proceed with formal discussion, I want you to see for yourselves who Rosalind truly is." Eleanor gestured to Helena, who stepped forward and began to sign. Rosalind watched intently, then moved to the center of the platform. What happened next stunned the assembly into complete silence. Rosalind began to speak, not with her voice, but with her hands. Helena translated aloud, but everyone could see the intelligence and passion in the girl's movements as she discussed matters of state. She spoke about the kingdom's trade relationships, about agricultural policies that could help struggling farmers, about the need for better roads to connect remote villages. Her knowledge was comprehensive, her ideas innovative. Eleanor had worked with tutors to ensure Rosalind understood every aspect of governance, but the girl's natural intelligence shone through in ways that went beyond mere memorization. She answered questions from the nobles, responding to challenges with grace and thoughtfulness that belied her 9 years. Lord Pemberton tried to interrupt, to point out that she couldn't communicate directly without a translator. But Rosalind was ready for this objection. She produced copies of the illustrated sign book Eleanor had commissioned, distributing them to the front rows of nobles. Then she taught them, right there, in front of everyone, how to sign basic greetings and questions. Within minutes, nobles who had arrived prepared to dismiss her were instead trying to mimic her hand movements, laughing at their own clumsiness, asking her to repeat signs so they could practice. Rosalind moved among them with patience and humor, correcting finger positions, demonstrating concepts, transforming skeptics into students. Eleanor watched with tears streaming down her face. Marcus stood beside her throne, his own eyes bright with emotion. "She's extraordinary," he whispered. "Just as I said." The demonstration lasted nearly 2 hours. By the end, even the most skeptical nobles had to acknowledge that Rosalind possessed intelligence, dedication, and leadership qualities that would serve her well as queen. More than that, they had learned that communication took many forms, and that someone who communicated differently wasn't necessarily communicating less effectively. Lord Pemberton rose to speak, and Eleanor tensed, expecting continued opposition. But the old lord surprised her. "Your Majesty, I came here today prepared to argue for a change in succession. I leave having been educated, not just about sign language, but about my own prejudices and limitations. Princess Rosalind has proven herself more capable than many heirs I've seen who possessed all their faculties. I withdraw my objections and pledge my support to her as rightful heir." One by one, the other nobles followed suit. Some did so grudgingly, but they did so nonetheless. By the time the assembly concluded, Rosalind's position was secure. That evening, after the nobles had departed, and Rosalind had finally collapsed into exhausted sleep, Eleanor found Marcus on the ramparts overlooking the snow-covered countryside. He stood with his back to her, but she knew he was aware of her approach. "We did it," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. She did it. She was magnificent. You both were. He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw everything she felt reflected back. Love, pride, hope for the future. "Marcus, about what we discussed before, about finding a way to be together." Eleanor took a deep breath. "I want that. Not immediately. Not in a way that would compromise either of us or Rosalind. But someday, when the time is right, I want to explore what might be possible between us." "Are you certain?" "The scandal. Let them talk. Today proved that this kingdom can adapt, can change, can grow beyond its limitations and prejudices. If they can accept a deaf queen, they can accept that their current queen might someday choose to marry for love, rather than political convenience." Marcus pulled her close, and she went willingly, resting her head against his chest and listening to his heartbeat. They stood like that for a long time, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "What happens now?" Marcus asked eventually. "Now we continue. You keep teaching Rosalind, keep helping her prepare for the future. Helena will stay on as her official tutor and advisor. And we—" Eleanor looked up at him, her green eyes bright with possibility. "We build something slowly, carefully, honestly. We give the kingdom time to adjust to one change before introducing another." "I can be patient," Marcus said. "I told you, I would wait forever if necessary." "It won't be forever," Eleanor promised. "Just a little while longer." The months that followed brought gradual transformation to Wintercrest and the kingdom beyond. Helena established a small school for deaf children, bringing in students from across the realm. Rosalind became an advocate for the deaf community, using her position to push for changes in education and accessibility. Nobles who had initially been skeptical found themselves learning sign language to communicate with their queen-in-waiting. Eleanor and Marcus continued their careful courtship, kept mostly private, but whispered about nonetheless. The kingdom watched and waited to see what their queen would do. But as time passed, people began to accept that perhaps this relationship was different. Perhaps it was real. And perhaps it was exactly what their queen deserved. 2 years after the Grand Assembly, on a spring afternoon when apple blossoms filled the air with sweet perfume, Marcus Thorne knelt before Eleanor in the palace gardens. Rosalind stood beside them, 11 years old now and vibrant with life, signing rapidly to Helena about the ceremony unfolding before them. "Eleanor, queen of this realm, would you honor me by becoming my wife?" Marcus asked formally. "Not because of politics or duty, but because I love you more than I thought possible to love anyone." Eleanor looked at him. This warrior who had changed her life by seeing her daughter's worth, who had shown them both that love could bloom even in the coldest winter. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you." Rosalind threw her arms around both of them, her signs joyful and exuberant. "Finally, I've been waiting forever." The wedding took place in summer, with nobles from across the kingdom in attendance. But the most memorable moment came when Rosalind, now officially recognized as heir apparent, stood before the assembled court and spoke, through Helena's translation, about love, acceptance, and the importance of seeing people for who they truly were, rather than what we expected them to be. Eleanor stood beside Marcus, their hands clasped together, and felt complete in a way she never had before. She had everything: the kingdom she had fought to preserve, the daughter who had proven that different didn't mean less, and the man who had shown them both what it meant to be truly seen and valued. As the celebration continued into the evening, with musicians playing and nobles attempting to sign their congratulations to Rosalind, Eleanor reflected on the winter feast that had started it all. She had brought her daughter to that gathering worried about judgment and rejection. Instead, they had found understanding, love, and a future brighter than she had ever imagined possible. Marcus pulled her close as they watched Rosalind dance with Helena, the two women communicating through signs and laughter. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking that sometimes the greatest gifts come in unexpected packages," Eleanor replied. "That warrior who showed up at my feast, covered in snow and road dust, not knowing that he was about to change everything." "I was just keeping a promise to a child," Marcus said. "I had no idea it would lead to this." "Neither did I, but I'm grateful it did." Eleanor leaned into him, content. "Every day, I'm grateful." As the sun set over Wintercrest, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the royal family stood together, queen, captain, and princess, bound not by tradition or duty alone, but by love, respect, and the understanding that true strength came not from conforming to expectations, but from embracing who you truly were. Rosalind would grow to be a wise and compassionate queen, known throughout history not for what she lacked, but for what she brought to her people. A broader understanding of what it meant to be human, to communicate, to connect. She would establish schools and centers throughout the kingdom, ensuring that deaf children had opportunities her generation had been denied. And she would always remember that winter feast, when a scarred warrior had knelt beside her and spoken in signs, showing her that she was not alone, that she was part of something larger, and that her voice, silent though it was, mattered just as much as anyone else's. The story of the Alpha Queen who brought her deaf daughter to the winter feast became legend, passed down through generations. But those who lived it knew that the true magic wasn't in grand gestures or dramatic transformations. It was in the quiet moment when Marcus Thorne had first signed hello to a lonely princess, in the patience he had shown teaching her, in the courage Eleanor had found to challenge a kingdom's prejudices. It was in the simple, revolutionary act of seeing someone, truly seeing them, and choosing to meet them where they were, rather than demanding they change to fit expectations. That was the real gift the warrior gave, and it was a gift that kept giving long after that winter evening had faded into memory. Years had passed since Eleanor's wedding to Marcus, and Wintercrest had transformed into something remarkable. The castle that had once been a place of whispers and judgment now buzzed with the fluid movement of hands and conversation. Servants signed to each other across crowded hallways. Nobles practiced their gestures during council meetings, and the sound of laughter, both heard and silent, filled every corner of the manor. Rosalind was 16 now, poised on the edge of womanhood and queenship. She had grown into a striking young woman with her mother's regal bearing and her own unique grace. Her copper hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and her brown eyes carried a depth of understanding that came from navigating a world that hadn't always welcomed her. But more than her appearance, it was her presence that commanded attention. The confident way she moved through rooms, the passionate intensity of her signed conversations, the genuine warmth she showed to everyone she met. Eleanor stood at her chamber window on a crisp autumn morning, watching Rosalind in the courtyard below. Her daughter was teaching a group of young children, some deaf, some hearing, the fundamentals of sign language. Helena supervised from a nearby bench, though Rosalind rarely needed guidance anymore. The girl had become a master teacher in her own right, patient and creative in her methods. "She's ready, you know," Marcus said softly, entering the room and wrapping his arms around Eleanor's waist from behind. His hair had a few more threads of silver now, but he was still the same warrior who had knelt before a lonely princess years ago. Ready for more responsibility, ready to start taking on real governance. "I know," Eleanor murmured, leaning back against his chest. "But giving her more power means the kingdom will scrutinize her more intensely. There are still those who doubt, who wait for her to fail so they can say, 'We told you so.' Let them wait. Rosalind has proven herself 100 times over. Besides, she won't be alone. She has us, Helena, and—" Marcus paused meaningfully. "She has Prince Henrik." Eleanor felt her chest tighten at the mention of the young prince from the northern kingdom of Nordholm. Henrik had arrived 6 months earlier as part of a diplomatic delegation, and what was meant to be a brief visit had extended indefinitely. The reason was obvious to everyone. The prince was deeply, hopelessly in love with Rosalind. "She cares for him too," Eleanor admitted quietly. "I see it in the way she lights up when he enters a room, the way she's been teaching him advanced signs even though he already learned the basics. But I worry, Marcus. Henrik is a prince. His kingdom expects him to marry for alliance, to produce heirs who can hear and speak in the traditional ways. What if his family refuses to accept Rosalind? What if he has to choose between love and duty? Then we'll deal with that when it comes. But I've met the boy, Eleanor. He's not the type to abandon someone he loves because of what others think. He reminds me of someone I know." Marcus kissed the top of her head gently. Before Eleanor could respond, a knock at the door announced Margaret's arrival. The lady-in-waiting looked flustered, which was unusual for her. "Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but Prince Henrik has requested an urgent audience with you and Captain Thorne. He says it cannot wait." Eleanor and Marcus exchanged glances. "Send him up," Eleanor said. "And Margaret, please ask Rosalind to join us as well." 20 minutes later, they were all gathered in Eleanor's private study. Henrik stood near the fireplace, his tall frame rigid with nervous energy. He was a handsome young man of 18, with fair hair and startling blue eyes that reflected the northern seas of his homeland. But today those eyes were troubled, and his hands, so expressive when he signed, were clenched at his sides. Rosalind entered last, her face immediately showing concern when she saw Henrik's expression. She moved to his side, her hands asking, "What's wrong? What happened?" Henrik took a deep breath and began to sign, speaking aloud simultaneously so that everyone could follow. "I received a message from my father this morning. The King of Nordholm commands me to return home immediately. There are complications." "What kind of complications?" Marcus asked, his warrior's instincts immediately alert to potential threats. Henrik's jaw tightened. "My older brother, Crown Prince Magnus, has fallen gravely ill. The physicians don't expect him to recover. My father wants me home to begin preparations for assuming the role of heir. He expects me to marry quickly, to secure the succession." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Rosalind's face had gone pale, and her hands moved slowly, almost reluctantly. So, you're leaving. Going back to marry someone your father chooses. No, Henrik said fiercely, both in voice and in signs. That's not what I want at all. He turned to Eleanor and Marcus, dropping to one knee in a formal gesture of supplication. Your Majesties, I have come to ask for Princess Rosalind's hand in marriage. I know this is sudden. I know there are political considerations. But I love your daughter. I have loved her since the day I arrived and saw her teaching those children in the courtyard, her whole being radiating joy and purpose. I want to spend my life with her, if she'll have me. Eleanor felt her heart constrict. She looked at Rosalind, who stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been hope. Henrik? Eleanor began carefully. Your father expects you to return and marry someone of his choosing. How do you think he'll react to you marrying Rosalind instead? I don't care, Henrik said bluntly. My father is a good man, but a traditional one. He doesn't understand that someone like Rosalind, someone who experiences the world differently, isn't weaker or less capable. She's extraordinary. She's built schools, changed laws, taught an entire kingdom to communicate in new ways. What other princess can claim such achievements? Marcus stepped forward. Prince Henrik, I appreciate your passion, but marriage between kingdoms is never simple. If your father refuses to acknowledge this union, it could create a diplomatic crisis. Your kingdom and ours have enjoyed decades of peace. We can't risk that lightly. Then don't think of it as a risk, Henrik argued, rising to his feet. Think of it as an opportunity. A marriage between myself and Rosalind would bind our kingdoms even more closely, and it would send a message that both our realms value substance over superficial perfection, that we choose leaders based on their character and capability, rather than arbitrary measures of normalcy. Eleanor turned to her daughter. Rosalind, you've been very quiet. What do you want? Rosalind's hands trembled slightly as she signed, her movements visible to everyone in the room. I love Henrik. I've tried not to, tried to be practical, but I do. When he's here, everything feels brighter. He doesn't see me as the deaf princess who needs accommodation. He sees me as just me, but I won't let him sacrifice his relationship with his family or his kingdom's stability for my sake. That's too high a price. It's not your decision alone, Henrik signed back, moving to take her hands in his. I'm asking you to marry me, Rosalind. Not despite your deafness, but because of everything you are. You've shown me that true communication goes far deeper than words. You've taught me to see the world differently, to value presence and attention and genuine connection. I want to build a life with you. Let me at least try to convince my father. Eleanor watched the young couple, remembering her own struggles years ago when society had tried to dictate whom she could love and how. She thought about all the times she had fought for Rosalind's right to be herself, to claim her place in the world without apology. How could she now ask her daughter to give up love for the sake of convenience? Marcus, she said quietly. What do you think? Her husband considered for a long moment. I think Prince Henrik is right. This is an opportunity, not just for our kingdoms, but to continue the work we started years ago, proving that different doesn't mean less. But, he added, looking directly at Henrik, you need to go home first. Face your father, make your case, get his blessing if possible. Rosalind deserves better than a marriage that begins with family conflict and resentment. Henrik's shoulders sagged slightly, but he nodded. You're right. I'll return to Nordholm and speak with my father. But I won't give up, Rosalind. No matter what he says, no matter what obstacles arise, I will find a way back to you. Rosalind's eyes filled with tears, but she signed bravely. I'll wait for you, however long it takes. The farewell 3 days later was heart-wrenching. Eleanor stood with Rosalind on the steps of Wintercrest, watching Henrik prepare to ride north with his small retinue. The young prince had spent every possible moment with Rosalind since their conversation, teaching her about Nordholm's customs and history, learning more advanced signs, making promises about the future they would build together. Now, as he mounted his horse, he looked back one final time. The expression on his face was one of determination mixed with anguish. He signed a simple message: "I love you. I'll return." Rosalind's response was equally simple: "I believe you." As Henrik's party disappeared down the snow-dusted road, Rosalind finally allowed herself to cry. Eleanor wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her close while the girl's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Marcus stood behind them, one hand on each of their backs, providing steady support. "Come inside." "My darling," Eleanor signed when Rosalind's tears finally subsided. "The cold is bitter today." But Rosalind shook her head. "I want to stay here a little longer, just in case he looks back." Eleanor's heart broke at the hope in her daughter's expression, but she simply nodded and wrapped a warmer cloak around Rosalind's shoulders. Together, they stood in the cold, watching the empty road long after Henrik had vanished from sight. The weeks that followed were difficult. Rosalind threw herself into her work with almost manic intensity, expanding the deaf school, meeting with advisors about trade policy, learning everything she could about governance. Eleanor recognized it for what it was: distraction from worry and heartache. But she also saw genuine growth in her daughter. Rosalind was becoming not just a capable princess, but a true leader, someone who could balance compassion with pragmatism. Letters arrived sporadically from Henrik. He wrote about his father's initial resistance, about the court's skepticism, about his brother's declining health. But he also wrote about small victories: a cousin who had learned sign language, an advisor who had suggested that perhaps modern kingdoms needed modern approaches to royal marriages. Each letter ended with the same promise: "I haven't given up. I will return." 2 months after Henrik's departure, on a gray winter afternoon that reminded Eleanor of the day Marcus had first arrived at Wintercrest, a messenger came thundering up the road. He bore the seal of Nordholm and carried an urgent dispatch for Queen Eleanor. Eleanor broke the seal with trembling fingers, Marcus and Rosalind watching anxiously. As her eyes scanned the formal script, her expression shifted from concern to surprise to something like joy. "What does it say?" Rosalind signed frantically. "Is Henrik all right? Is his brother?" "Crown Prince Magnus has died," Eleanor said quietly. "Henrik is now heir to the throne of Nordholm, and his father, King Olaf, has invited us, all of us, to Nordholm for the memorial ceremonies and for discussions about a potential alliance through marriage." Rosalind's face went white. "He's inviting us? But I thought..." Henrik said his father opposed the match. "Apparently Henrik has been more persuasive than even he realized," Marcus said, reading over Eleanor's shoulder. "Look at this part. King Olaf writes that his son's dedication to you and his passion for building bridges between different communities has impressed him. He wants to meet you himself, to see if Henrik's descriptions of your capabilities are accurate." "It's a test," Rosalind signed, her hands sharp with anxiety. "He wants to evaluate me, to see if I'm worthy of his son. Then we'll show him exactly how worthy you are," Eleanor said firmly. "We'll travel to Nordholm, and you'll demonstrate what Henrik already knows, that you're extraordinary. But Rosalind," she added gently, "you need to understand that King Olaf may still refuse. Henrik is now heir to his throne. The pressure on him to marry appropriately will be even greater than before." "I understand," Rosalind signed, but Eleanor could see the determination in her daughter's eyes, the same stubborn courage that had carried her through every challenge life had thrown at her. The journey to Nordholm took 2 weeks through harsh winter conditions. They traveled with a full diplomatic retinue, nobles, advisors, and guards. But the core group consisted of Eleanor, Marcus, Rosalind, and Helena. During the long days on the road, Helena worked with Rosalind on presentation skills, on ways to demonstrate her capabilities without seeming boastful or defensive. "Remember," Helena signed one evening as they rested at an inn, "you're not trying to prove you're as good as a hearing princess. You're showing them that you bring unique strengths to the table: perspective, resilience, innovation. The deaf community you've built isn't a charity project. It's a testament to your leadership and vision." Rosalind nodded, but Eleanor could see the fear beneath her daughter's brave facade. This wasn't like the Grand Assembly years ago, where they had been on home territory with allies surrounding them. This was hostile ground, and the stakes were impossibly high. When they finally arrived at the capital city of Nordholm, Eleanor was struck by its austere beauty. The city was built of pale stone that seemed to glow in the weak winter sunlight, and the royal palace sat on a hill overlooking a frozen harbor. Everything about it spoke of strength, tradition, and unyielding standards. King Olaf received them formally in his throne room. He was a man in his 60s, tall and broad-shouldered like his son, with Henrik's blue eyes but a harder, more skeptical expression. Crown Prince Henrik, for that was his title now, stood at his father's right hand, and his face lit up when he saw Rosalind enter. The formal introductions were cordial, but cool. King Olaf welcomed them to Nordholm, expressed his condolences about traveling in such harsh weather, made all the appropriate diplomatic noises. But his eyes kept returning to Rosalind, assessing her with the sharp gaze of a man who had ruled for 40 years. That evening, there was a memorial feast for Crown Prince Magnus. Eleanor found herself seated at the high table with King Olaf, while Henrik was placed next to Rosalind further down. The king watched his son throughout the meal, watched how Henrik's hands moved constantly as he signed to Rosalind, watched how the young couple seemed to exist in their own private world, even in the crowded hall. "Your daughter has made quite an impression on my son," King Olaf said finally, speaking to Eleanor in a low voice. "He talks of nothing but her intelligence, her compassion, her strength." "Rosalind is remarkable," Eleanor agreed carefully. "But I suspect you didn't invite us here just to hear a mother praise her child. You want to see for yourself if Henrik's assessment is accurate." King Olaf's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "Henrik tells me you value plain speaking, Your Majesty." "Very well, then. Yes, I'm skeptical. I've seen court infatuations before. Young men who convince themselves they've found true love, only to realize later they were attracted to novelty rather than substance. Henrik is my heir now. His choice of wife will affect generations. I need to know if your daughter is truly capable of being a queen, or if my son is blinded by sentiment." Eleanor felt anger flare in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Then test her. Give her real challenges, real problems to solve. Don't judge her on her inability to hear. Judge her on what she can do." King Olaf studied her for a long moment. "Very well. Tomorrow, I'll call a council meeting to discuss several pressing issues facing our kingdom. I invite Princess Rosalind to attend and contribute. We'll see how she handles herself in a room full of skeptical advisors who don't know sign language and won't be inclined to accommodate her." It was a trap, Eleanor realized. A room full of hostile strangers, no one except Henrik able to communicate with Rosalind. It was designed to make her fail. But she also knew they had no choice but to accept. "Princess Rosalind will be honored to attend," she said coolly. That night, Eleanor, Marcus, Helena, and Rosalind gathered in their guest chambers to prepare. The challenge facing them was formidable. How could Rosalind participate meaningfully in a council meeting where no one spoke her language? "I'll translate," Henrik offered immediately when they explained the situation. "I can voice what she signs." "No," Rosalind signed firmly. "That makes me look dependent on you, like I can't function without you as my interpreter. It plays into exactly what your father fears, that I'll be a burden rather than a partner." "Then what do you suggest?" Marcus asked. Rosalind thought for a long moment, then her hands began to move rapidly. I write my contributions. I've been practicing my written Nordholm language for months. It's not perfect, but it's functional. And I bring visual aids, maps, charts, diagrams. I show them my thinking rather than just telling them. That could work, Helena said thoughtfully. It actually gives you an advantage. Your contributions will be more considered, more thought out than spontaneous verbal responses, and the visual elements will help people understand complex ideas more quickly. They worked late into the night, preparing materials, anticipating likely topics, crafting responses. Rosalind's hands moved constantly, sometimes signing, sometimes writing, always thinking. Eleanor watched her daughter work and felt a fierce surge of pride. This was what they had raised. Not a princess who would let others define her limitations, but a leader who found creative solutions to every obstacle. The council meeting the next morning was exactly as hostile as Eleanor had feared. King Olaf's advisors were old men, traditional in their thinking and openly skeptical about Rosalind's presence. They spoke rapidly in their own language, making no effort to slow down or simplify for the foreign princess who couldn't hear them. But Rosalind had come prepared. Helena sat beside her, providing written summaries of what was being discussed. And when Rosalind had something to contribute, she would write rapidly on parchment and pass it to King Olaf, who would read it aloud. The first few contributions were met with polite indifference, but then the council turned to a thorny problem. Several outlying villages were struggling with food shortages, and the advisors couldn't agree on how to address it. Some wanted to send emergency supplies, others argued it would create dependency. The debate grew heated, with no resolution in sight. Rosalind listened intently to Helena's summaries, then began to write furiously. When she finished, she stood and brought her parchment directly to King Olaf. But she had also prepared something else, a map showing the affected villages, with annotations about population, existing resources, and transportation routes. King Olaf read her proposal aloud, his voice growing more interested as he continued. Rosalind had suggested a hybrid approach, immediate food aid for the most desperate cases, but paired with a program to help villages develop sustainable local food production. She had identified specific crops that would grow well in those regions, proposed a seed-sharing system between villages, and outlined a training program where successful farmers could teach struggling ones. The room fell silent when he finished reading. Then one of the oldest advisors, a man who had been particularly skeptical, spoke up. That's actually quite innovative. It addresses both immediate need and long-term sustainability. Where did a foreign princess learn so much about our agricultural challenges? Rosalind wrote quickly and passed the parchment to Henrik, who had remained silent until now. He read it and smiled. Princess Rosalind says she spent the journey to Nordholm studying reports about your kingdom that Prince Henrik provided. She believes a good leader needs to understand the specific challenges facing the people she might someday serve. The advisors began to discuss Rosalind's proposal seriously, and Eleanor saw King Olaf watching his son's face. Henrik was glowing with pride, his eyes never leaving Rosalind. And slowly, Eleanor saw the king's expression shift from skepticism to something like grudging respect. The meeting continued for hours, and with each contribution Rosalind made, the atmosphere in the room changed. The advisors began to direct questions specifically to her, waiting patiently for her written responses. They started to appreciate that her method of communication, slower and more deliberate, actually led to more thoughtful, well-reasoned proposals. By the time the council adjourned, several advisors had approached Rosalind directly to ask detailed questions about her ideas. Eleanor watched with satisfaction as her daughter handled each interaction with grace and intelligence, never apologizing for needing to communicate in writing, never acting as though her deafness was a weakness to be overcome. That evening, King Olaf requested a private audience with Eleanor, Marcus, and Rosalind. They met in his study, a warm room lined with books and maps. Henrik was already there, standing near the window with barely contained nervous energy. King Olaf gestured for them to sit, then turned to Rosalind, He spoke slowly, clearly, knowing she could read lips to some extent. Princess Rosalind, I invited you here with considerable skepticism. I thought my son was infatuated with an exotic idea rather than genuinely in love with a capable partner. I was wrong. Rosalind's hands began to move, but King Olaf held up a hand. Let me finish. Today you demonstrated not only intelligence and creativity, but adaptability. You didn't demand that we accommodate your communication needs. You found ways to work within our systems while still making valuable contributions. That shows strength of character. More than that, it shows leadership. He turned to Eleanor and Marcus. Your Majesties, I would be honored if Princess Rosalind would consider marrying my son. I believe she would make an excellent crown princess, and, eventually, Queen of Nordholm. More importantly, I believe she and Henrik truly love each other, and that's rarer and more valuable than any political alliance. The room erupted in joy. Henrik rushed to Rosalind, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. When he set her down, they signed rapidly to each other, both crying and laughing at once. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her own face as Marcus pulled her close. But even in the midst of celebration, practical questions remained. Your Majesty, Eleanor said to King Olaf, how will this work? Rosalind is heir to my throne, and Henrik is now heir to yours. We can't both lose our successors to a foreign kingdom. King Olaf had clearly considered this. I propose a dual arrangement. Henrik and Rosalind will divide their time between our kingdoms, learning to govern both. When the time comes for them to assume their thrones, and I pray that's many years from now, they will rule jointly, creating a formal alliance between our realms. It's unprecedented. But then again, so is everything about this situation. Over the following weeks, the details were worked out. Rosalind and Henrik would marry in the spring in a ceremony split between both kingdoms. They would spend 6 months each year in Wintercrest and Nordholm, learning governance, building relationships with nobles and commoners alike. Most importantly, King Olaf committed to establishing deaf education programs in Nordholm, following the model Rosalind had created at home. The night before Eleanor, Marcus and Rosalind were to return to Wintercrest, King Olaf hosted a small, intimate dinner for both families. The formal hostility had melted away, replaced by genuine warmth and mutual respect. As they ate, Rosalind taught King Olaf basic signs, and the old king surprised everyone by how quickly he learned. You know, he said thoughtfully, signing thank you with clumsy but sincere fingers. My late wife would have loved this. She always said I was too rigid, too bound by tradition. She would have adored Rosalind, would have learned to sign fluently within a month. Henrik smiled sadly. Mother would have fought for this match from the beginning. She never cared about convention, only about happiness and authenticity. She was wiser than I am, King Olaf admitted. But perhaps I'm learning. He raised his cup in a toast. To Henrik and Rosalind, to the alliance between our kingdoms, and to the future they'll build together. May it be as strong and beautiful as the love that binds them. Everyone drank, and Eleanor felt a sense of completion wash over her. This was what she had fought for all those years ago. A world where Rosalind could be fully herself and still claim everything life had to offer. Love, respect, power, purpose. Her daughter would have it all. The journey home was joyful, filled with plans and dreams. Rosalind was a different person than the frightened child who had attended that first winter feast. She was confident, capable, ready to take her place as both princess and bride. And she carried with her not just the promise of marriage, but the knowledge that she had been tested and proven worthy on her own terms. When they arrived back at Wintercrest, the castle erupted in celebration. Word had spread about the engagement, and the entire kingdom seemed to be rejoicing. The deaf school organized a special ceremony, with students creating a massive banner in sign language that read, "Our princess found her prince." That evening, as Eleanor stood on the ramparts watching fireworks light up the winter sky, Marcus joined her. "We did it," he said softly. "We raised an extraordinary woman who will change both kingdoms for the better." "We did it," Eleanor agreed. "But more importantly, Rosalind did it herself. She never let anyone tell her she was less, never accepted limitations others tried to impose. That wasn't us. That was her own strength." "Maybe," Marcus said. "But she learned that strength from watching you. You never gave up on her. Never apologized for her being different. You taught her that different could be powerful." Eleanor leaned against her husband, watching the lights dance across the sky. Somewhere below, Rosalind was celebrating with Helena and the students, planning her wedding, dreaming of the future. The girl who had once clung to her mother's skirts at a feast, frightened of judgment and rejection, had become a woman who commanded respect and found love on her own terms. It was more than Eleanor had ever dared to hope for. But then again, Rosalind had always exceeded expectations. That was who she was. A deaf princess who heard more clearly than most, who spoke more eloquently through silence than others did with thousands of words, who proved that the only true limitations were the ones we accepted for ourselves. The fireworks continued to bloom across the dark sky, bright and beautiful and full of promise. Just like Rosalind's future, just like the future of both kingdoms, bound together by love, respect, and the revolutionary idea that everyone, regardless of how they experienced the world, deserved the chance to shine.